Having visited a Macri excavation site, as well as having visited the Macri laboratory, and more importantly, accepted remains that Macri had found and recovered, I can tell you that we could not have a better partner, a better friend than Macri. And so, Director Lee, on behalf of the families, this year's poster for you to hang at Macri. For those of you that have visited South Korea, you know that your trip was sponsored, paid for generously by the Ministry of Patriots and Veterans Affairs. MPVA has traditionally been a superb supporter, partner of our veterans as well as Gold Star families like yourselves. The reception that we'll have later tonight, this evening at 5 p.m., is actually paid for by MPVA. So with that, I'd like to introduce, with a recorded message, their minister, the Minister of Patriots and Veteran Affairs, His Excellency Kang Jung-ai.
존경하는 6.25 전쟁 참전, 미군의 실종, 포로, 전사, 장병, 유가족 여러분, 반갑습니다. 대한민국 국가보훈부 장관 강정혜입니다. 우선 6.25 전쟁으로 위기에 처한 대한민국을 위해 미군 실종, 포로, 전사, 장병들이 보여주신 숭고한 희생과 헌신에 대한민국 정부를 대표하여 깊은 존경과 감사의 뜻을 표합니다. 또한 사랑하는 가족을 먼저 떠나보낸 슬픔에도 영웅의 가족이자 후손으로서 자긍심을 잃지 않고 살아오신 유가족 여러분께도 진심 어린 격려와 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 그리고 뜻깊은 행사를 준비해 주신 켈리 맥케이그 국장님을 비롯한 미국 DPAA 관계자 여러분께도 감사드립니다. 미국은 우리나라가 가장 어려웠던 시절 따뜻한 손을 내밀어준 친구이자 참전 용사의 피로 맺어진 혈맹의 나라입니다. 북한의 남침으로 대한민국이 절체절명의 위기에 놓였을 때 미국은 UN 안전보장이사회의 즉각적인 파병 결정을 이끌어냈고 22개 참전국 중 최다인 178만 9천 명의 용사를 보내주셨습니다. 첫 전투가 있었던 오산 중미령을 시작으로 위대한 승전을 거둔 낙동강과 인천을 비롯하여 혈전이 벌어진 장진호와 수많은 고지들까지 대한민국의 곳곳에 미군의 피와 땀이 닿지 않은 곳이 없었습니다. 총 13만 6천 명의 숭고한 희생에 힘입어 6.25 전쟁은 공산 세력을 막아내고 자유민주주의가 승리한 전쟁으로 역사에 기록될 수 있었습니다. 정전협정 직후 체결된 한미 상호 방위 조약은 대한민국이 전쟁의 상처를 극복하고 오늘의 번영을 이루는 근간이 되었습니다. 이 자리에 계신 여러분, 대한민국이 이룩한 평화와 번영은 70여 년 전 잘 알지도 못하는 먼 나라를 위해 흘린 미국 용사님들의 피와 땀, 그리고 유가족 여러분들의 눈물에 빚지고 있음을 대한민국은 결코 잊지 않을 것입니다. 이에 대한민국은 2015년부터 6.25 전쟁 미군 실종, 포로, 전사, 장병의 유족분들을 대한민국으로 초청하거나 미국으로 직접 찾아가 정부 차원에서 최고의 예우로 모시고 감사를 표하고 있습니다. 또한 대한민국의 산하에 잠들어 계신 영웅들을 찾아내어 하루빨리 여러분의 품으로 돌려보낼 수 있도록 유해 발굴에도 최선을 다하겠습니다. 마지막 한 분까지 그렇게 해드리는 것이 살아남은 자들이 해야 할 최소한의 의무라고 생각합니다. 6.25 전쟁의 위대한 승리와 영웅들의 숭고한 희생, 그리고 대한민국의 놀라운 성장까지 지난 70여 년간 한미 양국은 언제나 함께 해왔습니다. 대한민국 정부는 미군 참전 용사님들의 희생과 헌신을 영원히 기억할 것이며 피로 맺어진 한미동맹의 역사와 가치를 미래 세대에게 계승하기 위해 노력하겠습니다. 유가족 여러분께 다시 한번 깊은 격려와 감사의 말씀을 드리며 오늘의 만찬이 여러분의 아픔을 조금이나마 보듬어 드리는 위로와 치유의 시간이 되기를 기원합니다. 감사합니다.
For today. So I'll ask our briefers, you know who you are, to come up and be ready for questions. Same routine this morning as the remembrance ceremony. Raise your hands high, and it's even more important now that you keep that microphone close to your mouth, and that way the folks will be ensured to hear the questions. So wait until someone brings a microphone to you. Rob? Before you ask your question. All right. Now we got two microphones converging on one hand. So all right, sir, you're the first.
Is DPAA utilizing any AI methodologies?
Can you repeat that again? I don't think the microphone was on, or either I'm deaf or not. I think I am.
Hello?
Now you got it.
Is DPAA utilizing any AI methodologies?
I can partially answer that. So to answer your question, we are exploring AI methodologies. We have an innovation team within the Partnerships and Innovation Directorate that is collecting proposals on artificial intelligence and other types of methodologies that do that. So I think that's as much as I can answer.
Right there. Okay. Dr. Bird and Tim, get up here, please, folks. All right. Another question? Go ahead, Joe.
My name is Peggy Dervais. I live in Vaughan, Washington, and I am here with my husband, Joe, Air Force, 20 years, and my daughter, who is a music teacher in Vaughan, Washington. We are here to remember my father, who was in some of the heaviest fighting in Korea. He was the 2nd Battalion engineer, and he went through a lot. And this is the first conference that we have been to, and I guess my one question to all of you, since you know a lot more than what I do, my dad's name was Hugh John Drennan. He was a master sergeant in the Army, and I literally know nothing about him. He was captured and injured and spent time in the caves, which I don't know about. And I think it was near the uranium mine in Suncheon. And I don't know anything else about him other than if any of you have heard of a Hugh John Drennan, I'd like to talk to you if I could. But he was injured, he was captured, he was in a concentration camp, and he died in the concentration camp, and the remains were never found. And the one thing that I have held on to as a believer, and which my dad was, never to give up the faith that I have in God, that I feel that God was probably closer to my dad and to all of your loved ones than they can even imagine. And that's what I hold on to, that sometime maybe some remains will be found and we'll be able to bring him back home, just as your loved ones, if it's the same situation, will be able to come back home.
Okay.
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Maybe my fault. Let me clarify here. These are general questions about the briefings that you heard today, okay? Tomorrow we'll have a remembrance ceremony, and we can continue with those, but these are questions about the briefings that have preceded. So I'll go over here.
Hi, my name's Jeff Wilkowski. My dad... Turn it on. Thank you. My name's Jeff Wilkowski. My brother's name is Ken. My brother's name is Ken Wilkowski. My dad's name was Sergeant Louis Wilkowski. He was killed, from what I understand, above the 38th parallel. Is there any way that we can find out more about this?
Sir, when you have your case summary review, you can ask your analyst those questions. So you should find out everything that we know about your loved ones lost. Here's another one up here. Raise your hand, please.
Thank you. My name is Steve Ticehurst, and my uncle
Is that
was
on?
lost in...
You gotta hold it closer to your mouth.
Okay. Yeah, my name is Steve Ticehurst, and we're here for my uncle who was lost in Korea. But my question is, you'd spoken a little bit earlier about funding. Do you think that the funding will continue through the years, the upcoming years? This has been, Korea's now has been quite a while ago, and do you think the commitment is still there? Thank you.
So the funding that I mentioned, that this is the first year that it was laid in, and again, it went from 150 million to 190 million. That was a commitment that is actually locked in for 5 years. And so again, we fully, by the way, it's also going to increase with inflation. So we fully expect not only for the next 4 years, but more importantly, beyond that.
Raise your hand, ma'am. Oh, sorry. Joe, go ahead. Go ahead, Donna.
I didn't see him there. I'm sorry. Thank you. Thank you all for everything that you've given us today. I have a question for Kelly. I noticed on the agenda that the only discussion about China's involvement with the POW MIAs has been set aside for the Cold War families. And so I was wondering if I could ask a question that perhaps you could answer here for the rest of us. A while back I asked about China's apparent reluctance to turn over its archives, which certainly include a lot of information about our missing service members. And the answer that I got was that China said that information belonged to North Korea, and therefore they were not at liberty to reveal it unless North Korea said yes, and then there was no further information. Of late, as I understand it from you, we have one of your members, your team members, meeting in Beijing with a counterpart to perhaps revise the 2008 Memorandum of Arrangement signed between our two countries, pursuant to which China was supposed to release records. Could you update us, please, on the status of that?
Dawn Berry here.
She's not in here yet. I think.
We'll get you, Donna, the information specifically about the May exchange. So in May, the DPAA sent a team to Beijing to meet with the PLA. And in that meeting, they talked about archival exchanges, photographs, research that was accomplished, research that we had asked them to accomplish. They turned all of those over. So our historians, our researchers are in the midst of looking at all of that and, more importantly, advancing the cases that were discussed in that meeting. At that same meeting in May, we proposed the update to the Memorandum of Agreement, understanding that we have had with the PLA. That's in the process of being worked on, finalized, and more importantly, I expect that we will sign it with the PLA before the fall. Sure.
Okay, go ahead.
Yes, hello. My uncle was in North Korea, and they labeled him as missing in action because they couldn't find his remains. I'm wondering, why didn't the KIA, because he was killed, KIA, so does that mean that they found the body and then they labeled it KIA instead of MIA?
Again, that's a case-specific question that's best answered by your during your case summary review. Okay, so
Can you explain to her about the terminology? That's what she's asking.
Okay, well, you mean like a presumptive finding?
Yes,
of death?
that's exactly what I mean, the difference
Okay,
between
well,
the label of KIA versus MIA.
Got it. There has been, after, and this goes back to World War II, there's a thing called the Missing Persons Act. And a year and a day after the last information that a service member is known to be alive, presumed alive, for the purposes of settling out estates and affairs, a person is declared dead. It's called a presumptive finding of death. They're declared dead, but without a body, but they are legally declared dead, and that's what that status means. So, for example, currently, all of the people that we're looking for are in a presumptive finding of death. No one is in a current day missing in action status. Does that make more sense? I mean, it's all legalese, but that's just the way it's been since World War II, at least. All right. You're quite welcome. It is confusing, trust me. All right. Anyone on this side of the room before? All right. I got to be fair to the right and left here.
Yes, sir. We have an online question. Coming in. Do we have any update on where we are in phase 5 of the disinterments? How many caskets are left to disinter?
Do you want to answer that, John?
Thank you.
Yeah, so can you hear me? Is this on?
I don't know. Is it on? It's on now. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so we're in the midst of preliminary work in phase 5 now. We've had remains come into the lab. When the remains come into the lab, we go through some initial processing steps that include assessing what we have, doing inventories, and then we begin the process of choosing what kinds of samples we're going to take, for example, to send to Dr. McMahon's lab for DNA testing. And then we also look at the potentiality of doing dental identifications, using stable isotopes and other techniques in the lab that we can use to try to narrow down the identity of the person. So with phase 5, we're kind of in these initial stages right now, but everything's progressing very well. And the DNA processing, I think, is progressing really at a rapid pace, and I think Dr. McMahon will talk about that a lot more tomorrow. I don't know if you want to speak to it.
with as we know, the disinterments, those are all the chemically treated samples. I'll talk more about our next generation sequencing, but this year again, we did a 20% increase, so our average is about 120 samples per month of those chemically treated, of which half are dedicated to the Korean War Identification Project. We have 278 ongoing samples actively being processed in our laboratory right now to the Korea War Project. 200 of those were received between January and April of this year, so we're processing in real time. The remaining ones are additional new testing samples from the earlier phases to try and either get results or to clarify results. So we've come a long way in the last 4 years with NGS. We've gone, when we brought that online in 2016, we were doing 4 samples per month. We're now doing 120 samples per month. Our success rate's gone from 24% to 68%. And so the phases are getting, for us, we're getting stuff in real time and being able to process that in real time for across all conflicts, to include the Korea disinterments.
And if you look on your schedule, folks, you'll see tomorrow from 1:30 to 2 a briefing by Ms. Kristen Groh on the Korean War Identification Project. And so she will provide an update on the whole phased plan. So.
Yeah, just one more quick point is that the disinterring that we're doing for Phase 5 will reach its final point in September. So we're making really good progress. Everything's on time, on schedule. Occasionally we get weather issues with heavy rains and stuff that might delay it a little bit, but everything's going to come out on schedule. And we also are looking forward to Phase 6 after that.
Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Since we are talking about the Korean War Disinterment Project, at this very moment, right now, in the Army briefing room, a family is receiving some news. I'll let John share.
And so because the primary next of kin has been given the initial briefing, and then there's other family members being briefed as we speak, then we can tell you that the name is Corporal Wayman Slattery. He was in the 2nd Infantry Division. He was lost in the very early part of the war at the Naktung Bulge area. And he was lost on a really kind of a famous battle called Hill 209. That was overrun by the North Koreans in September of 1950. We had identified several years ago another soldier, Lieutenant Edmund Lilly, Jr., who was also lost on Hill 209. In the case of Corporal Slattery, though, he was disinterred as part of Phase 3 back in 2021. And we have now, in conjunction with our partners at AFDIL and AFMES, we've now been able to determine the identity and identify him. So that's a good success story that's happening right now.
Since I've discovered that family reference samples could be misaligned in someone's family tree, I wonder if the techniques of forensic genealogy are being utilized. Are sequences from the remains being uploaded to public databases, not the NDIS?
So, ma'am, that's an excellent question. I'll touch on it a little tomorrow, but this is a much more in-depth question. So when you talk about forensic investigative genetic genealogy, or FIG, that's being used to solve cold cases, there's actually only 2 databases. Ancestry.com and 23andMe are not those. You can't physically upload. However, it's apples to oranges. So, for example, the test that you do when you do Ancestry.com and 23andMe, you take you either spit into a cup or you send a swab, and they look at 850,000 markers, and you need those to be able to trace who you are and how you're related to somebody. In 2017, we tried those commercial kits, and out of 850,000 markers, we recovered 40,000, which doesn't allow you to do anything. Tomorrow I'll talk about a 5-year project, 6-year project that we're doing to develop our own method to do that. And it fits with all of the references that we have collected since 1992, which I have on hand and we can go back to. But to answer your question, we do come across those where we may find somebody who was adopted, or genealogists aren't able to find a reference. Our method will allow us, and we are working with those companies that allow searching of their databases to see if we can do a special search in the future. But that was a great question.
Okay, this young lady here.
I have a question going back to what you said. You said there's 278, I don't know how to describe it, I don't know, identifications that you're going to do. Where are you getting these identifications? Are these coming from the punch bowl, or are these just given to you as they come? Like, where are you making the identifications? Where is the collection coming, I guess?
Okay, for Korean War, we have basically consolidated our efforts for identifications in the Korean War into our Korean War Identification Project. The project lead is Ms. Kristen Groh. She's going to give a presentation tomorrow that'll give you kind of an overview of what's going on in that project. Kristen right now is involved in briefing the family about Corporal Slattery's case, so she's not in the room at the moment, but you'll be able to hear her presentation tomorrow and ask her more questions if you have. But in the short, just a very short answer, we have remains from several different sources that have come into our laboratory to be identified. One is the Punch Bowl Cemetery, these unknown remains in our phase plan, and we're into phase 5 now, but we're still working very hard to identify remains from phases 1 to 4 also. So that's a big source. And last year, we made 39 identifications of Korean War missing soldiers. 32 of them were out of this Punch Bowl phase plan. So it's a big, important source of success for the Korean War program. But we also have remains that we excavated in North Korea back between 96 and 2005. We have remains the North Koreans turned over to us in the early 90s, and then again in 2018, the K-55. So these are all sources of remains in the lab, and we're making identifications. And then the last I'll mention, which is not the least important, is we've made 19 identifications from remains that have been turned over to us by Macri and by the Ministry of Defense in South Korea before Macri stood up in 2006. And so that's also another important source of remains and a source of success for us.
And yes, so I quoted the 278. So just so you understand that, those are 278 bone specimens or samples that have been submitted by the DPAA. It doesn't mean that that's going to be 278 new identifications because they've been chemically treated. And give you an idea, those samples we've been able to show are as damaged as 40,000-year-old Neanderthal DNA. So they're tough. So sometimes we will get 3 samples because we don't know which one may work. And so in that 278, there may be multiple samples from the same person, or we may find an additional portion. But we, just to let you know, we just had 278 associated with those punch bowl disinterments. The K-55 samples, they're not chemically treated. We're working them in a separate group in our system. So we're working all this in conjunction with everything else. So, thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead. Me? Yeah, Rick, go ahead.
Hello. I have a comment that I guess Director McKeague would be best for. It really was for Mr. Bailey and Ambassador Turner, but they're not here. But I think it's important in terms of policy that is being made and for all of us to see, and that's the full picture or portrayal of North Korea's response to the recovery mission. The flavor that I get, and I think this came mostly from you, Director McKeague, in this group, is that they're the problem. And right now they're not talking, but the history of their involvement in this mission is much more positive. And I think this is important for us to know, and I think it's important for policymakers to use in terms of overtures. You spoke about accountability, and Ambassador Turner, that the U.S. should take some accountability for its role in holding back the mission over the years, and at the same time acknowledge that North Korea's efforts, they have made, the unilateral returns that you're talking about, the early 1900s and the 2007 to 2007, Governor Richardson, and then the 2018 unilateral return. Those were unilateral returns. North Korea just said, here. And so many the JROs, the Joint Recovery Operations, were ended by the U.S. The 2010, the North Korea made another overture. So they sent back a photograph of a missing American's dog tag and said, we have remains, what do you want us to do with them? And they were just said, basically, hold on to them. We can't do anything with you until you behave in the larger picture issues, which I'm not saying, I have no input on that. But in terms of this mission, in 2016, we were able to go over to North Korea and received an offer from them for remains returns that we turned over to the administration at the time, and they were declined because of the larger issues. So it's important that if in taking accountability is a part of saying, look, you have done some good things, and we appreciate that, and we have maybe not been as responsive as we would like. You spoke about the Berlin Wall coming down, and something like that, we don't know, apologies are pretty cool to get and to give, or some sort of accountability that you mentioned, and that if the policymakers that were here today and above were to use that and just acknowledge North Korea for what they have done in this mission, we don't know about what that might, well, okay, maybe we'll talk now that you have acknowledged that. So, Director McKeague, I don't know what you have to say about this. It doesn't look good, but but I think that it's important that everyone here understands the full picture, that they have been very cooperative in many ways, and a lot of the identifications are coming because of their willingness to return remains unilaterally. And on a higher level, it might be nice to use that tactic to open their eyes and say, maybe they'll be a little more responsive. That's all.
Yeah, Rick, you're absolutely right. And I'll let John describe the evolution, but in the early 90s, it was unilateral turnovers, 5 years in a row. We were the ones being complimentary of what they did with those unilateral turnovers to suggest joint recovery operations, which then proceeded for 10 years. And then, as you heard Rick say, episodically, 2006, 2007, 2018, there were unilateral turnovers. We were encouraged that when President Trump met with Chairman Kim in Singapore, there were 4 commitments, 3 that were well beyond remains recovery and repatriation, denuclearization for one. We were encouraged that the policy leaders, from the White House through the State Department, through the Department of Defense, unequivocally said, we want to separate remains recovery and repatriation from the other 3. We were given carte blanche to deal directly with the Korean People's Army, and we did. 2 face-to-face meetings, many of the same people that our folks had negotiated with over the years. And we did that, 2 face-to-faces, multiple exchanges, but all that was done under the umbrella of open transparency and, more importantly, completely separated from the bigger geopolitical issues. We were allowed to do that. So I think the policymakers recognize that this is a good thing. This is a potential opening, door opener, a potential temper the temperatures, simply because it's humanitarian in nature and it's met with success over the years. John, could you talk about the evolution? Sure.
I'm not a fan of Korea or anything like that, but I think it's important to say their role in all of that too, that they were willing and that they followed up with the 2018, the 55 boxes as a gesture, as follow-up to that. Again, it was all one-sided what you just said. A balance would be nice. That they, in this issue, this is an issue that they are willing to talk about, that they are willing to collaborate with, and I don't feel that our policymakers are allowing that to happen as well as they could. And I would like to see in your portrayals, you know, that they have a role and have been some sort of supportive of this mission very strongly. Thank you.
Yeah, I would respectfully disagree simply because North Korea was the one. So after the 55 boxes, we gave them full credit, full appreciation, had another face-to-face meeting, exchanged multiple letters, phone calls to effect the fulfillment of that commitment, to repatriate what they already have, and two, to resume recovery operations. March of 2019, they were the ones that ceased communications and haven't communicated with us since, despite overtures not only from us, but from the State Department, Department of Defense, even the White House. So we're not sure of the dynamic of what changed because literally it went from let's talk, let's see how we can fulfill this commitment from the statement made by President Trump and Chairman Kim, only to have the door shut, not just tight, but triple, quadruple sealed. And we don't understand that dynamic.
When was the Hanoi Summit in 2019? Was that before?
The Hanoi Summit was in February of
Okay, so
2019.
Kim was left at the altar by the U.S. president leaving those negotiations. You know, the U.S. walked out of the Hanoi Summit. I don't think it's any coincidence that then the month after they weren't going to talk about this. So that's the kind of balance that I would like to hear and presented, that it's the U.S. has a role in why this is not happening. And that if accountability you're talking about, I would love to see that, because where might that take us? If we were to stand up and say, okay, sorry about that, you know, can we go on anyways? So that kind of balance is what I would like to see, and that's what I'm trying to share.
But, you know, ironically, the example that the North Koreans have been given by policymakers is look to Vietnam. Think about this. 10 years after the war, 10 years before normalization, in the midst of economic sanctions, in the midst of trade embargoes, it was Vietnam that said to the United States, let us help you with recovering your missing. Look at Vietnam today. Still a communist state, still a single-party state, still centrally controlled, and yet it benefits from prosperity economically, security, stability. It's a great exemplar, and policymakers have pointed that out, the Vietnam example, to the North Koreans to simply say, what's changed? Well, what's changed is that based upon confidence and trust on this very humanitarian effort, look where Vietnam is today. Look how the Vietnamese people benefit. Look at their prosperity, their stability, their security. That was 10 years after the war, 10 years in the midst of economic sanctions, the same things that North Korea is still arguing with the United States on and being bitter about, except it was in 1953. Nothing's changed, except they've become more recalcitrant, they've become more entrenched, and as you heard from our colleagues from the State Department, sadly, they've become very insular, even more so. But Rick, honest to goodness, not just from DPA, State Department, DOD, any interactions, any overtures that are being made, just at the very lowest to the highest levels, this mission is put forward as an exemplar for what the art of the possible might be. Could you speak to the evolution from the 90s to, because I think that's important.
Yeah, so in the early 90s, 1990 to 1994, they started a series of unilateral turnovers each year that came across a little in drips and drabs over the years until there were 208 boxes by the end of the 1994 turnovers. And we've called them the K208 in the laboratory for many years. Those unilateral turnovers came across and were presented as, each as remains of a service member. With very cursory information that came with them, usually the name of a village. And back in the early 90s, these were really small villages. No one was even sure where these villages were. And so for a long time in the early 90s, we weren't making any progress identifying those remains, and it was very confusing. And this was the early days of DNA testing, just as AFDIL was beginning to ramp a capability, and so DNA wasn't going to be a panacea solution. So in response, the lab said, am I running out of battery?
No,
okay. The lab said, it would be better if we recovered the remains, because then we'll know where they came from. And if we have detailed locational information, it'll be better. So between 1996 and 2005, the North Koreans allowed us to send teams in and excavate every year a certain number of sites. And this was supposed to be a big improvement in the situation, but it wasn't the improvement we thought it would be, primarily because what they were doing is taking remains they already had in storage, and they were placing them out in these sites for us to find. So it was generally just more of the same kind of material we had already received in the early 1990s. Meanwhile, we began to get much better at identifying these remains. The DNA testing matured, became much better. We became more effective at using the tools that we had, whether it was dental information from databasing all the dental records, or just better use of the DNA results that Dr. McMahon's lab could give us. We got a lot better at it. So when we got up to 2018, and we were given the opportunity to ask for something as part of these talks that were going to happen in Singapore, we said, we'll take another unilateral turnover first, and second, we'd like to go back in and continue recovery operations. And as you know, we did get the unilateral turnover, and we had hoped to go back in with recovery operations, but that never happened. The talks kind of fell off the wagon, as everyone's been discussing. But what I can tell you is that having worked in North Korea, I did, I think, 5 different missions there. I spent more than 8 months in North Korea working over the years, and then working with them with the unilateral turnovers in 2018. I can tell you that, for them, it's kind of a transactional endeavor. They're willing to give us something as long as the U.S. government's willing to give them something. So you don't get the impression that it's a humanitarian goodwill endeavor on their part. It's quite transactional for them. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to eventually start to make progress again. It seems inevitable at some point, as Mr. McKeag was saying, something's going to give, and we're going to start making progress again. And one of the encouraging things that we heard today from the State Department reps is they said there's no preconditions. When they send these overtures to North Korea, they're not putting preconditions on them, saying only if you do this, we'd be willing to talk to you about remains turnovers or recoveries. So, there is some hope despite the fact that you're talking about the most difficult country in the world to deal with, whether it's at the highest levels of government or whether you're just a guy like me working on the ground on a daily basis with them in the country. It's a very, very difficult group of people to deal with.
I have a question. It may be for you, Dr. McMahon. I'm not sure.
Is that on?
Okay. I'm interested personally and hopefully in Phase 5, the isolated graves. I think Monday they disinterred 8 boxes, right? And I think there are 16 more to go, correct? The question, I guess, in general is just the protocol, the timeline. What happens now that when all of those 16 plus the other 8, particularly looking at the isolated graves that I'm interested in for sure, what happens next to those? Is this going to be a year before those will even be in the hopper to look at?
Yeah, and this goes back to the process I was mentioning earlier. When the remains first come out, we exhumed them literally with the help of the cemetery staff. We resumed them out of the graves and bring them by truck over to DPAA, and we have to remove them steel coffins. So that requires a lot of, get your hands dirty, elbow grease kind of work to get them out. We then bring them up the stairs into the laboratory, and then we clean up all the remains, and then we start the process I mentioned of inventory, what we've got, pick things that can be sampled and sent to the DNA lab. Is that a better one?
Let's try this one.
Yeah, I think
Great.
the battery's
Turn that
dying.
one off.
See if this one, is this better?
Give it a
No.
second.
How about now? Okay. Yeah, so we have to then, after the remains are cleaned up, they're then brought out in the lab, and we go through this process of initial study, inventory, everything we've got. We do things like determine, is this more than one person? And often it is more than one person represented. We determine if we have enough to potentially do a dental identification. We have the dentist start recording the dental patterns. We look at the bones that may be suitable for a chest x-ray comparison. And we pick the samples that we're going to take and send to Dr. McMahon's lab and get that process going so those samples can be sent to him in a timely manner. So these are the initial things you see going on right after a disinterment occurs.
Well, knowing that that this is going to have to happen by the end of September, this disinterring of the next 16, I'm just wondering, after that, when does any of that process start, getting into the steel boxes? That would be next year or October, because you're still doing 1 through 4, and I know very busy, and we're grateful. But I'm just trying to think about if there was something there from these boxes or these caskets. When would that process start on them, beginning with everything you said? I'm sure they don't start October 1st, so next year?
The ones that came in last week, they're already doing that now. That process is undergoing right now. And then the next group that we'll disinter and bring in, the process will commence as soon as they're in the lab.
Okay.
But we go through different phases of analysis. So
right.
You go through initial phases, which is very, very busy, of cleaning, inventorying, selecting samples, cutting samples, the dentist recording patterns, doing x-rays, things like that. And then when you've sent samples off, like we've sent samples to Dr. McMahon's lab, we've sent samples maybe to our isotope lab, and then you're going to need to wait for results to come back in to take it to the next step. So you're doing a lot of staggering of the effort. So when we're sending samples away from phase 5, we're getting results back from phase 4.
Right.
And then from phase 3, we may have decided to take additional samples from what we did initially based on information we got in the interim time, and that goes out. And so there's a lot of juggling all of these different tasks. But the work's being done in real time, but it's like you're juggling a lot of different balls with the analytical work.
The durations are different like that. I just wanted to know, like, at what point then do families get any inkling that you might have something going? At what point of those different many analytical things you're doing?
Yeah, sometimes we get very lucky, and you get a case that comes in that is a relatively easy, say, dental identification. And we did have one from World War II from Saipan recently, where we were able to identify him in like less than 3 weeks from when he came in the door, because we were able to use all the dental work he had done and some very good dental records to make that identification very quickly. But most of the cases that we're doing are not that easy. Most of them are more challenging.
Right. Thank you very much.
So to answer your question, when we get in the lab, remember I said sometimes we will get upwards of 3 samples. If they think there's one person in there, we'll get the 3 best samples because we don't know what's going to work. We are part of the slow part of it. We are working in real time, and if I told you 60 samples a month, I have 270, you're talking about 4 months that we would get through that lot. The reason for that is we're not a one and done lab, and I'm going to talk about this tomorrow about fit for use. If we test a sample and it doesn't pass the analytical threshold, but it's close, we're going to go back and troubleshoot that. And we have to do everything in duplicate. So when I say that we report to the DPA 3,500 analyses per year, it's 7,000 analyses because we have to do everything in duplicate. But what I can tell you is from start to finish, when we start an extraction and we report the DNA summary to the lab, that's about 55 working days. That's about the same time your state and local crime lab does a high-quality sample. And we're doing everything in duplicate. So we're trying to get faster and better, but we don't let ourselves outpace the science because the last thing we want to do is make a mistake. And so, but like John said, there's feedbacks all back and forth. So if we return a result to John and his lab, and it opens a door, and we've excluded 10 people, and there's 2 left, and that may be what is needed to get that identification out. So there's a constant feedback talking loop on that too. Right. I'm going to talk a little bit about that tomorrow. Yep. Right. No, so the question is, if you don't have the DNA and you have just the x-ray and a clavicle, but there's no dental, is it going to be put away and forgotten about? And the answer to that is no. Every time that we develop a new method, and I'll say every time the DPA develops a new method, we go back and look at those cases where we may need more evidence or we may need something. And there have been IDs last year from samples that originally came to us for DNA testing in the early 90s, but it took until 2020 when science and technology catches up. So that's a great question on that is we always go back and revisit that. We look where the new science is going. 9 times out of 10 you'll hear tomorrow when we talk, what you hear on CSI and everything doesn't work for us. We actually have to develop it. And so a little peek behind the curtain, we're going to talk about fit for use tomorrow. so great question on that.
So you all know, many of you know the indomitable Dr. Don Berry. Please come up. So Donna, to follow up on your question, we actually sent Don to Beijing in May. Don is our subject matter expert on all things Korean War history, And again, Dawn was on the front lines with the PLA at that May exchange. So if you could explain to them what happened.
Yeah, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this tomorrow with the general group and also with the Cold War family breakout for those of you who are Cold War families. So, and I might get a little bit emotional because I was just sitting down with a family member who got some of the paperwork that the Chinese provided to us. So I think it's fair to say that they were very happy to receive this, and that was one of the goals of us going to China. So we were able to go to the PLA, so the People's Liberation Army Archives building. From what I understand from the embassy staff, this is one of the first times that U.S. individuals or government employees have been allowed to go to that building. The main purpose was to write an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, to help us to continue to do archival exchanges. That was one of the main objectives. We shared information about cases that we had, and then they shared information about cases that they had, the investigations that they had done in cases that we requested in the past. We also talked more generally about Korean War losses and Cold War losses, and also they had some questions for us about some of their losses during the Second World War and asked us some research questions. We're trying to make this reciprocal, meaning we often ask a lot of information from them and for them to do research for us on our cases and give us information. They also have questions and don't necessarily have records on their losses. So we did provide a few to them as well. And to the best of my knowledge, I think this is one of the first times that they provided physical documentation to us about specific cases. So that's sort of everything that happened in a nutshell. And if there are questions that people have, to the best of my ability, I will answer them. I tend to be a little bit effusive, and so I'll try to keep that dialed back and not get too emotional. Did that kind of cover it? Okay. Thank you for the question.
All right. I'm going to go ahead.
Hi, my question is, with the increase in the budget that you just mentioned today, will that money go toward upgrades and improvement of the labs and hire additional personnel to decrease the time for identification, or just how will that money be used?
Okay, so a lot of the increase in budget was driven towards being able to increase field operations, and we are doing that in a pretty significant way. But there's also other increases that you have to do to be able to do things like more field operations. And so I think you'll see there's growth with the regional directorates, with additional historians and other personnel needed to help make these things work. And then for the laboratory, we've also enjoyed some increase with our personnel, not anything like, huge, but we are incrementally increasing different kinds of personnel to better position ourselves to be able to keep a pace with this growth. Equipment as well. Yeah, we're making some pretty significant improvements in equipment. Several years ago, we added a stable isotope laboratory, which we now just kind of throw around talking about stable isotope testing, but we have expanded the actual capability and throughput of that stable isotope lab in the last 2 years. And we're looking now at an additional increase not only in the quantity of samples we can process, but also the types of testing we can do. So right now we do light isotopes, things like mostly carbon and nitrogen, but we can also do hydrogen and sulfur. We're looking now to making a jump to doing heavy isotopes, which would be like strontium and lead. And we think that we'll get actually more benefit from having the heavy isotopes than we're even getting from the light isotopes. So that's a plan that's right now in the works of putting together how and when we're doing that. We're in the process now of purchasing some micro CT scanners, which are going to be an enhancement for us for doing the chest X-ray comparisons. And this has to do with our ability to capture a 3D image of the remains that are on the table that can be then digitally compared with the antemortem, the x-rays from back in the day that we have that we compare to. So there's a number of different types of equipment. We've had some field equipment enhancements too. We've added some new types of magnetometers recently that we've been using. We've used to good effect in Vietnam recently, for example, and also in Europe. So yeah, there's been a number of increases in equipment, types of testing we can do along with some additional personnel.
In addition, part of the budget increase was also the fact that we were allowed to hire 16 historians. You know, as John mentioned, field activities is one thing, but unless you do the base foundational research to progress the case to a field activity, you're basically throwing darts in the dark. So part of that was these 16 historians, researchers, are now on board to help us advance cases, to be able to do all those field work, but also to put accessions into the laboratory.
All right, go ahead, Rob.
This question might be to the Macri representatives. Those recovery efforts that he was talking about, do all of those remains belong to service members who perished in South Korean territory? Or do you all have some connections that you're getting some things from North Korean territory as well?
그 유해 발굴은 저희 국내에만 이루어지고 있습니다.
Thank you. I'm kidding. Sorry.
You understand me?
No. 감사합니다.
I didn't know you speak Korean.
Me neither. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. 그 국내에서만 이루어지고 있고 19년부터는 우리가 그 DMZ 안에서도 이루어진 바가 있습니다. 그런데 지금 남북 간의 긴장으로 인해서 지금은 DMZ 안에 유해 발굴은 잠시 중단되었습니다. 그리고 북한과는 미국은 그 북한한테 들어가기도 하고 넘겨받기도 했는데 저희들은 북한과는 지금까지 교류를 한 적이 없습니다. 북한은 모든 문을 닫아놓고 저희한테는 열어주지 않고 있습니다.
First of all, thank you for your thoughtful questions. To answer your question first, we Macri conduct recovery operation in South Korea. And actually from the 2019, we have conducted recovery operation in the DMZ areas. But you know what? Due to the geopolitical tension between South Korea and North Korea, we couldn't do it now. So the all operation were just came to halt. So, and I know that North Korea and the United States had repatriated the remains from each other, but for South Korea, we have never done or we have connected to North Korea to have the joint recovery operation like that.
지금까지 저희들이 그 2000년부터 하면서 약 900여 구의 북한군 유해를 찾아놨는데 저희들이 가져가라고 그래도 가져가지 않고 있기 때문에 우리 그 임시로 매장해서 저희들이 북한이 가져가기만을 기다리고 있습니다.
The Macri was initiated in 2000, and we have recovered like 900 North Korean remains. And we request North Korea that you guys need to get your North Korean soldiers, but they actually never responded to us. So we just kept the remains in the certain place that is kind of temporary storage to let them to get those remains to their country, but they never responded to our request.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Joe, back here.
Hello. A couple of years ago, there was an initiative mentioned about working with the Chinese universities, the archaeology departments. And I was wondering if you had progressed with that to help with uncovering remains. That's my first question. The second question is the U.S. the only country that does this type of, not search and rescue, but recovery of remains? Only because if you recover remains and you find someone like maybe from New Zealand or Canada, right? So what happens in those situations?
So I'll answer the first question. So a few years ago, as you mentioned, we, as you know, are expanding our public-private partnerships. And so we have the authority with which to enter into arrangements with universities, non-governmental organizations, both domestic and international. To date, we have 105 of these all over the world. We were looking at a couple of universities in China, People's Republic of China, that specialize in archaeology, anthropology, to enter into one of these public-private partnerships. COVID hits. And so that initiative is one that will need to be restarted. But now that we have an open channel of communications with the PRC, we will raise that at some point in the near future because, again, we DPA, and not just DPA, but the U.S. ambassador to China, the U.S. Embassy, the State Department, Department of Defense, look at this as, again, people-to-people ties to be strengthened, but more importantly, a channel of communications that is effective and offers, again, answers not only for families from both sides, and as you heard Don Barry say, we're looking for reciprocity in terms of exchanging helpful research and information that both sides can benefit from. I'll let John explain to you about the fact of we're not the only ones, but we and the South Koreans are the only ones that do it to the degree, scope, and scale that we do, but there are others that John can expound upon.
Yeah, in terms of other countries that are pursuing a mission like this, I think the United States and MACRI are the best examples of operations that are pretty comprehensive. I mean, everything from field recovery capability to DNA testing in the laboratory and everything in between. Both MACRI and the U.S. effort, DPAA and AFMES, we do all of that. But there are other countries that have programs. The Japanese are a good example of a country that has a pretty large program to go out and try to recover their missing people. And they have a fairly robust system of trying to do recoveries out in the Asia-Pacific region, but they have a pretty relatively meager capability for actually doing the laboratory testing when they do find remains. And the reason is because until recently, the Japanese did not have human identification as part of their mandate. They were supposed to recover them, cremate them, put them in the shrine or something like that, but there wasn't a laboratory testing effort. And so we've been working with the Japanese over the last several years to ramp up a better testing capability so they can do a better job for their own citizens. But our selfish interest in that is that we know they're going to find American remains when they're out on these battlefields recovering remains. And we want to make sure that when they do recover American remains, that they know they've recovered American remains. And so another country is Australia. Australia, we work with the Australians as partners, and in fact, Director Lee mentioned a three-way U.S. ROK Australia effort in Korea, and there are a lot of Australians, around 50 or so Australians missing from the Korean War, and we work cooperatively with them to make sure if we come across their remains that we're going to know it and can repatriate those remains to Australia. MACRI routinely finds remains of our allies in their work that they do, and they repatriate them to the home country. I personally have seen French, Canadian, and British remains in their laboratory that they've been able to repatriate, in addition to the Americans that they find. And so all of us, we work together as partners. And we try to develop enough of a strong system of communication that when we find remains of someone from one of these other countries, that we are able to recognize that, which is the first important step, is to even know you have them, and then to be able to communicate with them to send the remains home to the right place. Mm-hmm.
Very good.
Most of what you're discussing seems to be that when the remains are on land, if you find remains in the ocean or in a lake, are you able to do the same things, or does the water just change it, the equation, and you're not able to do it?
Yeah, generally, and I'll let Tim speak to his side of it, but generally speaking, contrary to urban legends and popular belief, remains in the water are usually best preserved. They're usually very well preserved, and we have great success finding not only remains that are in underwater sites, but finding personal effects, sometimes clothing, all kinds of things that are often quite well preserved. And there's a number of reasons for that. If it's in a cool place, just being cool for all those years helps with the preservation. If it is down in sediment, then sometimes it even gets to where there's no oxygen in there. We say anaerobic. That helps with the preservation. And so there's a number of reasons why when we find remains in the water, we often find a lot of pretty well-preserved remains and artifacts to go with them. Now, I'll let Tim speak to DNA preservation.
So John's absolutely correct. Contrary to what people would think, salt water actually and others preserve the DNA within the bone. I mean, if we think about, right, how did you preserve meat in the 1800s? You salt cured it. But there is a chemical issue with it. So the bones will absorb that salt. Although it's anaerobic conditions, there are anaerobic bacteria that get in there, but we don't have as much what we call non-human DNA competition. The biggest part is if you've ever watched the Discovery Channel, right, and they find the gold coin on the shipwreck, right, what do they first do? They put it into a bath where they put an electrode on it, and it's called desalination. It's to remove the salt from it and to protect it. Well, in 2013, I was visiting the lab, and we hadn't gotten results from some of the water, so I talked to Denise Toe, Dr. Toe at the time. And so the next underwater recovery they did, they called me from the boat and said, what is the salt water, what is the salinity of the water that you need? And I said, well, I need drinking water, 108 parts per million. So they desalinated on the boat. We get the sample back. It worked like a gangbuster. So the bottom line is when they do an underwater recovery, they put the bone in water and they start changing this highly purified water until all the salt comes out. And we get DNA. If we leave the salt in, the way that we dissolve the bone and get to the DNA actually precipitates out. So if you've ever made rock candy in your life, right, you drop the little piece of sugar in there and the sugar comes out all over the stick. Well, in this case, the DNA falls out and we lose it. And so by doing this step, it has increased our success rate. So it is a great preservative. And we thought at depth, the deeper you go, that would have an effect on, the pressure. For every 33 feet you go under the water, you add one more atmosphere of pressure. And so if you're down at 300 feet, you would figure potentially that would be crushing the DNA in the bone. And we did some work on a current day loss, and it had no effect on the DNA, the pressure. So it's basically a preservative, the cool environment, and we have worked out ways to get around the salt water.
Quick question for the gentleman here. You mentioned about the water changing the body composition. Does that mean that when you find those human remains that the flesh is still there, intact?
We have not we have not found the soft tissue in underwater sites that we've been doing so far. I wouldn't say it's impossible, but so far we have not found that. We have found soft tissue in other contexts before, even from sites from 50, 60, 70 years ago. But usually it's something like if you have a pocket of fuel, that the remains are in the pocket of fuel, the fuel can act as a preservative and you might have some soft tissue preserved. Would be one example of where it can happen, but it's very, very rare for our cases.
Thank you so much. All right. We've got a couple questions here, so don't wander off, Joe.
Thank you. Ms. Carolyn Wright had a very good question, but had to leave to go to her case study, but did return. And she was wondering to what extent satellite imagery or surveillance was being used to locate potential recovery sites.
I'll ask my colleagues to come up and expound upon it, but essentially we're working with current day satellite imagery agencies. So not only are we using satellite imagery from the past, wartime imagery, correlating that through GIS, correlating it through current day satellite imagery to, again, find those correlations. We're doing that today. So using technology from mainly the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, NGA, they're bringing their capabilities to bear such that allowing our historians and researchers, analysts, to overlay past battlefield imagery with current day satellite imagery to hopefully find something that we can action. Chris, anything to add?
All right, go ahead now.
Thank you. I've been told that my father's plane most likely would have been shot down by the Chinese pilots. So my question is regarding the access you've been given to Chinese materials. Did they keep meticulous records like the Russians for planes that were shot down? Would that be something that we might be getting access to?
Could you defer that question until tomorrow? Dr. Berry would be eminently qualified to answer that question.
Okay, and then...
None of us would dare venture into her territory.
Okay. And the second question is, this morning you mentioned that you will be working with Macri on an underwater recovery. Do you know in what general area
so it's off
that
the coast
will be?
It's off the coast of Busan.
Okay.
Director Lee can talk about it because we're going back there for the second time. We were there last year working again with the Republic of Korea Navy as well as Macri, and we're going back in September. And I believe his slide indicated that they had finished 25% last year of the site. This year is to hopefully finish out the rest of it. But it's off of Busan.
Okay.
지금 올 작년과 올해는 부산 지역에서 우리가 지금 비행기가 바다에 추락한 것은 세 군데가 있습니다. 그래서 하나는 부산, 한 번은 강릉, 그 다음에 한 번은 서해, 즉 남쪽 바다와 동쪽 바다, 서쪽 바다가 있는데 지금은 작년과 올해는 남쪽에 지금 계획을 하고 있고 추후에 올해 11월 달에 우리가 그 조사 합동 조사에 관한 우리가 회의를 같이 합니다. 한국에 와서 DPA에 와서 할 때 아마 다음 해에 어디로 할 것인가를 정하는 회의를 하게 될 것 같습니다. 그래서 강릉하고 그러니까 저 동해하고 서해는 나중에 계획을 해서 할 예정입니다. 혹시 질문에 답변이 되는지 모르겠습니다.
Yes, thank you for your question. As the Director Kelly said, Macri will carry out the second underwater survey with DPAA for this September. And actually there are total 3 spots three spots for underwater survey, and the Busan is one of the sites. And other than the Busan, there are two other sites like Gangneung or the western area of South Korea. And we MACRI have a coordination meeting with Australia and U.S. in this November, and we will choose where to have further underwater survey investigation in this October during the court meeting.
That gentleman there.
Good afternoon. So I have a participating family that has a question based on, was this considered a war or was it considered a conflict? And I asked that question because their family was given medals from their fallen soldier and was told to return the medals back because it wasn't considered a war. So can you guys clarify that for us and let us know either way?
I don't have an answer. That may be better for your Army casualty, I assume whatever service casualty office. For medals?
Right. So they were given the family was given medals based on their fallen soldier, but because because it was considered a conflict, they were told to give the medals back. But they gave them back. So we're wondering, was it considered officially a conflict or was it considered officially a war? And they gave them back because they were considering it a conflict.
That's more of an awards question. I'm not sure. Greg Gardner can answer that question. Thank you. Thanks, Greg.
So I'm Gardner with the Army Casualty Office. So I will sit down and talk to you afterwards because that should not have been the case. There is no difference as far as the Army is concerned for the awards. If a soldier, and we do them all the time for the Korean War, and we give them to the families. So I'll talk to you afterwards, and I'd really like to know the details of what happened. All right? All right. Great. All right.
Thank you, Greg.
Your greater question really brings to bear, because I've never understood it, and really it's the lawyers that differentiate. So if you look at what DPAA does, it's past conflict accounting, not past war accounting, past conflict. And there's nuances between whether an engagement was considered a war or a conflict. I don't understand it, but I'm glad Greg, we phoned a friend and he provided the lifeline.
Yeah, thank you. I was drowning.
Let me get I'll ask our lawyers about that, because again, I'm clearly not cognizant of the difference between what is designated one thing and what's designated another.
I think what the director's important point, for purposes of what we do, accounting for the missing, it doesn't matter. Whether it's a declared war like World War II or a conflict like the Korean War and the Vietnam War. I don't think there's been a declared war since World War II, but we still account for all those people. So that's really where the most important fact that affects you all. Go ahead.
When the North Koreans returned the remains in 2018, do they provide specific locations of where those remains are found, how they were found, so that maybe when we get back in there, we kind of have an assist as far as specific locations, and are they prioritized by evidence, those type of things?
It should be.
Okay. Yeah, what we got in 2018 was very similar to what we got in the early 1990s. And what you get is you get a box, and in the box is a village name. And that's pretty much all the context information we get. However, in the early 1990s, the village names were baffling because they weren't even on maps a lot of times, and we weren't sure where those places were and what they meant. But now, after many, many years of identifying a lot of people and figuring out, okay, now this village name we know applies to this battle, or some village names apply to a POW camp. And now we know that. So in 2018, when we got the boxes and it was the same pattern of just village names, it wasn't really a problem for us. We knew a lot of them came from East Chosin Reservoir, for example. We knew a lot of them came from the Unsan area, from where the 8th Cav Regiment was, based on the village name. We knew some of them were from POW camps and places, all because now we know how to kind of crack the code on what a village name means. But that's what we got, were village names. Yeah.
Okay.
A brief change of topic here. For the last 2 years, I have not received the list of attendees to this meeting. Is that not being sent out anymore, or am I on the bad list?
We're going to send it out this year.
Pardon?
We're going to send it out this year. On your survey, you have to consent to your name and info being shared. So if you do that, you will receive all those people who've consented to the sharing of their info. We will send that to you after the meeting.
Would it be possible to pick up the last 2 years separately somehow?
I don't know if that would be possible. I honestly don't know if we have that. We'll have to check on that.
Because apparently nobody got them.
Well, it kind of dropped off. There had only been a few people asking for it, and so
well, for my purpose, it's very helpful.
Sure. We'll look in to see if we can provide that for the
Thank you very much.
All right, Joe.
I'm wondering what percentage of families have given their DNA versus the number of deceased?
Ma'am, that's an excellent question. When we look at the Korean War, I base it off the original 8,100 missing. For that original 8,100 missing, I have references for 92% of those missing service members. Just to give credit to our partners at the Service Casualties, they got a large single influx of money around 2009, 2010, where they went out and they scrubbed the genealogy for all of those missing. And that's when we started to get an uptick in the references. And really, once we get over 80% in references, we can actually be very, very much more helpful to the laboratory by scoping complex remains that are commingled and things like that. For Vietnam, for example, it's 85% of the missing there. World War II is a different story, but we are attacking that kind of differently. So if you take like the Battle of Tarawa, there's about 498 missing there. Right now I'm at 88% coverage for those missing as we're doing activities there. So, but for Korea it's 92%.
Great. Go ahead, Ryan.
I grew up with the knowledge that there's no stupid question. So here's mine. Considering natural disasters that occur, torrential rains, floods, other conflicts, what have you, and then also talking about trying to identify villages today that were there 70 years ago. With the knowledge that remains can be relocated in other spots, how does this affect your identification of the remains? Do you find this as an issue?
So if I understand your question, and you're right, there is no dumb question here. If I understand your question, you're asking if natural disasters in the Korean Peninsula have affected our ability to identify people. Yeah, it's more likely to affect our ability to find people, but not always in a negative way. Sometimes remains are found because you have washout on a hillside from heavy rain, and suddenly you can see there's remains there. The bright side would be sometimes things like heavy rains expose remains that wouldn't have been seen otherwise, and they get found that way. The downside would be if things like flooding and heavy rains wash remains away to where no one will ever find them. And if that's happened, of course, we don't know because we wouldn't know because we haven't found them. But I don't really see that as a big factor for us, even though we know that there's been a lot of flooding in North Korea over the years. You know, you hear the news reports coming out of there. Flooding events may actually help the North Koreans find remains when they get exposed in heavy rain, after heavy rains. But if that's been a factor helping them find remains that they've turned over to us, we wouldn't know because we really don't get really any information about how they found them and how they recovered them. As I mentioned a moment ago, we pretty much just get a village name, and that's all we know. You guys have any personal experience of how natural disasters may have affected your ability to find remains?
자연재해로 인해서 이제 유해가 좀 손해되거나 그런 경험이 있는지 개인적인 그런 경험이 있는지 한번 여쭤보죠.
그럼 우리하고 관계없는 시에야지. 그 자연재해가 있을 때는 저희는 태풍이나 홍수 피해가 많기 때문에 여기 미국에는 허리케인이나 뭐 그러면은 이런 것들이 오듯이 우리가 그럴 때는 피해가 있는 경우가 있습니다. 잃어버릴 경우도 있고 또는 손상이 된 경우도 있는데 저희 같은 경우는 특별한 경우가 아니면은 저희가 국가에서 운영하는 과학수사연구소가 있기 때문에 그 부분들이 투입이 되고 저희들은 특별히 가지는 않는데 우리 그 한강에 있는 다리가 무너졌을 때 그때 우리 인원들이 이제 차에 탑승했던 사람들이 강물에 빠졌습니다. 그때 우리가 투입해서 신원 확인을 도와준 적이 있고 그다음에 백화점이 한번 무너졌을 때 이때도 한번 전체 인원들이 있을 때 가서 우리 직원들이 그 신원 확인을 도와준 적이 있습니다. 그러니까 우리는 자연재해 그 위에는 국가수에서 주관합니다.
Actually, there is, first of all, the South Korea is usually affected by typhoon or flood. And I think that is the big difference between the U.S. is that you are usually affected by hurricane, but our country is affected by flood and typhoon during this summer. And to the answer of your question is that rather than our agency, there is a special organization named NFS, which refers to National Forensic Service in my country, and they actually do have expertise in the kind of damage remains when there is a disaster. So we usually send the information, or we are just supported by them, but we do not actually have exact information on the damage remains because of the natural disasters.
Right. Anyone else? Where are you pointing to? Sorry. Where? Who are you pointing to?
Patricia.
Oh, I can't see. All right. I need someone with a mic over here. All right. There you go, Ryan. You go. I can see you.
Hello. Lost my uncle, missed in action, Braulio Flores. I'm proud to have my son here. I've named him after my uncle, Jose Flores. I have a question for everybody here. Who wants to go to Hawaii? Who would like to go to Hawaii? Raise your hand up.
Yeah.
The reason I ask that is because most of our remains, from what I understand, are in a punch bowl. Is that correct? In Hawaii?
The unknowns.
The unknowns, yes, the remains.
Other than the one that's in the Tomb of the Unknowns at Arlington, all Korean War unknowns were buried at the Punch Bowl.
At the Punch Bowl. My question is, for example, my wife and I, and my son, we were discussing how much it costs for the organization to send, fly us out here. And she said, "Boy, that's a lot of money." I said, "You know what?" I said, "It is. But that is not anything that it costs for the loss of our uncle, my uncle." I said, "He gave his life away defending the South Koreans." And my thing is, we talk about the Punch Bowl, that a lot of remains are there that are unknown. Why can't 1 year have this conference held in Hawaii so that not just myself or anybody else can see where the Punch Bowl is? Because let's say my uncle is identified in about 10 years and I'm no longer here. Maybe my son will be here, and if my remains are identified, at least I can say, "Hey, I was in the Punch Bowl. His remains were exonerated and examined, and I can at least say that I was there where my uncle was after he's, again, if he was identified, or for any loved one from here, from this audience."
Aspects of why it's here in Washington? I don't know.
I'll tell you the honest answer why it's in Washington is when the modern day accounting business starts with the Vietnam War. And so there was legislation passed that it was Vietnam only. There was going to be an annual government briefing, and it was in Washington. And so in Jennifer, was it 96 or 97 when we had the first Korea-Cold War? I think, something along about that time when we expanded into the Korean War accounting, then it was just natural that we would do it in Washington. So most of you families live in the continental U.S., and so the idea, we did have it 1 year, if you recall, in St. Louis, where the National Personnel Records Center was. But other than that, we've always done it in Washington, D.C.
I think we'd go.
Oh, I'm sure. So would I, Rick. I was actually hoping for Tahiti, but, what can I say? I think, do you want to tackle if we're going to do that, sir?
Ironically, this is something that we do in partnership with the service casualty offices. And so your coin-assisted funding is not DPAA's. It's actually the service that your loved one fought for. It's an interesting prospect. We'll take it up with them and see if there's an art of the possible, see if there's an appetite. I mean, we did it in St. Louis.
Right. And we're talking about maybe doing it somewhere else. I'm trying to push him.
We'll take it under advisement.
Right. That's about as good an answer as you can get on that one right now. So, all right.
Over here.
Microphone. Where? I can't see. Oh, go ahead. You got to wave your hand, Rob.
So our family was just contacted just a couple of months ago to submit, DNA swab and stuff. I'm not sure what predicated them finally looking for us, because we've been here all this time. And then during my private meeting, they mentioned that they have a general idea off the coast where they think the plane went down, but nobody's really looking right now because it's probably cost prohibitive. So what prompted them to suddenly search out our family and ask for DNA swabs?
So I'll tackle part of that. We like to be proactive, and as technologies advance, so in the early 1990s, we were collecting brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers, or maternal. That's all we could do. In 2013, we started to be able to get different tests online and have perfected those. And I can afterwards, come see me. You're here. I can pull up what references we have. It may have been that we were missing a paternal reference, somebody on the father's, down through the missing service member's father's side, the Y chromosome, that precipitated it. It could have been the advancement that we're doing underwater recoveries, and in a case review or historical review, it came up that it could have been associated potentially with that area, and we needed to fill it in. There's a lot that could go into it that predicates going out, but for us, having that family reference on hand and in the database proactively, my team is really good. I will say that hands down is really good at generating a DNA result. But if I don't have anything to compare it to, it's just a DNA result. And so it could have been just that. We're trying to fill in the gaps based on new technologies that we're developing. It could have been something else. So, but we can chat after this if you want and see what type of reference it was.
Yeah, I'll just add two things. One is that we're getting better and better at underwater recoveries, and we're doing more and more of them. In the lab, we have now 5 underwater archaeologists, permanent staff. We have, diver experts assigned to DPAA, and of course we work with the Navy and the Army divers to do the investigations and recoveries in the water all over the world. And then we also work with partners who do underwater recoveries all over the world. The other thing I would tell you is that we've made 2 identifications from the Korean War from bodies that washed up on the beach. One of them Macri found many years ago. In fact, I think it was the first ID we made after Macri stood up in 2006. That was remains they found was a sailor who washed up on the beach and had been buried by locals, and the U.S. government didn't know it. We also had a pilot before that the Ministry of National Defense had recovered. He had washed up on the beach, still wrapped in his parachute, in South Korea. And so, you never know is the point that having the DNA in the bank, as Dr. McMahon said, is always the best way to go. Because one way or the other, either because we eventually plan a recovery operation or because, maybe remains from people in that aircraft may have washed up at some point and may end up in our laboratory through some indirect means. Either way, having the DNA in the bank is what's going to make that work for an identification.
I think, first of all, thank you for all the information you share. And I think I heard that the Russian archives were pretty much shut out to us currently. I'm wondering if somebody could say what success we've had when we were able to, and then also what efforts are being done to reestablish that relationship.
So I mentioned to you the U.S.-Russia Joint Commission. It was established in 1992, an agreement between President Bush and President Yeltsin. Our executive secretary to the commission is actually a former Army Foreign Affairs officer, Russian specialist, Darla.
Hi. Yeah, we have had success in the past going to the archives. It's mainly with Korean War that we've been able to get information from the archives. Unfortunately, right now we are unable to access the archives, but we are continuing to go through information we gathered before we lost access to it. We are still pursuing options to get into the archives and get into other archives if possible. And then the second part of your question was, if you can say that again. Status. Okay, yeah, we are still trying to get in there, but unfortunately, because of the geopolitical situation right now, we cannot get in there. And additionally, the co-chairman, the chairman on the Russian side, as the director mentioned earlier today, unfortunately, he died in February. And it does take a while for the Russian side to go through the process to nominate and appoint a new chairman, so we haven't been able to do that. Once we get that new chairman appointed, then we hope to start communications again with them and be able to give you more information.
So the door hasn't been shut?
The door has not been shut. We are a presidentially appointed commission, and so our charter says that until the mission has terminated or the president closes the commission, we will continue to operate.
Go ahead.
I have a quick follow-up to that question. I'm sorry, I didn't know her name.
Darla.
I'm sorry. I tried to stop you.
Don't run off.
So fast.
When you say that you did get into the archives initially, did you find any evidence, any information that confirms that American POWs were transferred to the Soviet Union?
So we have received anecdotal evidence of Americans being transferred, but we have not found any verifiable evidence of Americans being transferred to gulags in the Soviet Union. There were some anecdotes about people being transferred, but any living people that were transferred have been returned. All of those have been returned.
Okay. All right, go ahead.
Turn around and there you are. I wanted to clarify the question about whether or not Korea War was actually confirmed as a war. It was told that many years before was a conflict, a police action, and then there were quite a few people that were coming forward, particularly in my state of Texas, saying to our senator, Dr. Kay Bailey Hutchison, which most of you know, and she combined with Pat Dutton from her father was missing from that war, and they marched a bunch of us into Congress. And I can say this because I was there. Kay Bailey Hutchison, our blessed senator, said, "This is not a police action. This is not a conflict. This is a war. It needs to be declared as a war, and it needs to be investigated as a war." That's when we went into major productions and started getting a lot of these people that we see today that were not involved then, but they're involved now, and they're working on our behalf. What's more, you know, I've seen a lot of these people come and go on our behalf, and didn't want to see them go. I'll miss Johnny Webb, and I'll miss Dan Bachman, but I believe and I trust that we have the best team that I have ever seen. And I've been coming for 30 years. Haven't missed a year. It's my firm belief that your brother, your cousin, your nephew, your father, your grandfather, they're coming home. I believe that. And I also believe my brother's coming home too. Thanks to this team that we've got. And we need to thank them, we need to bless them, and we need to support them and go home and tell our television, our newspaper, all about it, because a lot of people don't know. Some of them don't even think we've got anybody really missing from Korea. We need to let them know. And I thank you. And I praise God for these people. Thank you.
Thank you.
The lady that was just speaking, you hit the nail very close to the head here for us, because my uncle was a B-26 pilot, and he disappeared over North Korea. We don't know what the final result was with him. And I haven't had the one-on-one conference here yet, but we have it tomorrow. But what came up some years ago was that a name very much like his came out of a KGB file. And it was the date was about the same time that he was lost. And we know no more information than that, which is why I'm asking you this question now. But was there other pilots or other people you think maybe went to Russia and disappeared there, never came out of there, or any further information along those lines?
So we have checked all of those names, and there's been, like I said, anecdotal evidence where we'll hear a name close to another name and dates possibly near the name. We haven't been able to find, I should say, correlate any of those to any of our cases. So we have never found that, but it does remain something that we continually look for and that we will continue to research. But we haven't found any evidence of it so far.
They wanted information about their planes and their techniques, flying. The Russians wanted that information from American pilots, so that's what I was thinking in that direction, but I don't know that, obviously.
Yeah, we have heard multiple stories, and mainly pilots, too, about that, and that not only were they transferred to the Soviet Union, but somewhere like Kazakhstan or somewhere. And so we've continually researched that since the beginning of 1992. It's a big reason why the U.S. RJC was started, the U.S.-Russia Joint Commission on POW/MIAs, is to investigate those claims. But we have not been able to confirm any, but we continue to research it.
Thank you. Back to the Joint Commission. Can you remind us the makeup of the commission? And is there anything that we can do to lobby to get things going back again?
Yeah, so the commission is made up of a chairman, both on each side, a Russian chairman and a U.S. chairman on each side. And then under that, for the U.S. side, there are 4 commissioners that are congressional commissioners. Right now we have Lankford, Manchin, Winstrup, and why am I blanking? Panetta. There we go. And then we also have 4 working group commissioners. The DPAA director is dual-hatted as a commissioner. We have a commissioner from Department of State, NARA, and then DIA. And that's on the American side, so that's, I think, mainly what you're concerned about there. I would say, what can you do? Really, there's not much that can be affected right now with the geopolitical situation, but I think just, continue to bring it up and support us in any chance that you can, that we can continue our operations and working for you.
Good, Rob. This lady back here.
This afternoon we spoke about what happens if a burial site is found in South Korea or North Korea. What about the DMZ? What if something is identified in the DMZ?
DMZ, is that about the...
Yeah, burial sites.
I'll start before Director Lee talks about it, because Macri actually operated in the DMZ after their president met with North Korea's president. They started at Arrowhead Ridge, then they moved over to White Horse Hill, and for the very first time, we had the very first joint Macri DPA investigation at Hill 111. That was last year. So again, up until the time that their president and North Korean president met to, again, lower the temperature and have various initiatives, taking out the guard shacks at the DMZ, allowing transit through the corridor, things were moving in a positive direction. North Korean provocations have since dialed that all back. And as Director Lee mentioned this morning, no longer are they working in the DMZ, but I'll let him speak to the fact that they had successful operations for the very first time inside the DMZ on the South Korean side of the line. And as I mentioned last year, we had the very first joint investigation at Hill 111.
2019년부터 하게 된 것은 우리가 북한하고의 합의에 의해서 DMZ 안에서 유해 발굴을 작전을 시작했습니다. 그런데 지금 현재 상태에서는 북한이 이 합의를 파기를 하고 다시 지뢰까지 이렇게 설치하는 이런 현상이 벌어졌습니다. 즉 우리가 합의한 절차를 전부 무시하고 있다는 거죠. 그래서 지금 현재는 할 수 없는 이 상황이 되었습니다. 그래서 이 문제는 매우 정치적인 상황이고 우리가 DMZ 발굴할 때는 지금은 유엔사 정전위가 우리 나라에 아까 부사령관이 말씀하셨듯이 그분이 들어와 있습니다. 그래서 그쪽 유엔 사령부가 공동 경비를 하는 지역에 우리가 유엔사하고 협조되면 오케이를 받으면 안에서 우리가 DMZ 발굴하는 인원을 편성해서 그 합의된 인원만 오케이 받은 인원만 들어가서 유해 발굴을 하게 되겠습니다. 그래서 우리도 하루바삐 빨리 이게 재개될 수 있도록 우리 국가에서도 노력하고 또 DPA에서도 노력하고 미국에서도 지금 노력을 많이 하고 있는 상황입니다.
Oh, thank you for your question again. To answer your question, yes, we have started the recovery operation in DMZ from 2019 in accordance with the agreement with North Korea. So at the time, we were able to conduct our own recovery operation in DMZ area. But as North Korea has fired this agreement, which is about September 19th agreement, we are unable to carry out further recovery operation in DMZ, unfortunately, and they are even installing the landmines in the DMZ area. And this is very political situation, I think. And the answer, the efforts that can be done for restart the recovery operation in DMZ is approval of UNC Armistice Agreement. So we need to get approval for that effort. After we get the approval from the UNC, we can deploy our own troops or our recovery members to conduct our recovery operation. So only allowed members can go inside for further operation in DMZ area. And I really hopefully to restart this DMZ areas because there are a lot of U.S. fallen heroes in that area, and our government and the efforts with the DPAA to restart this operation is ongoing, and I really hope to start it again.
All right, we're getting very close to our cutoff time. So if anyone have a short question? No? Okay. Well, just remember you have a Q&A session tomorrow. So if you don't feel like you missed out. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead. Thank you for everyone up here. Thank you very much. That was ringing, by the way. Just as a reminder, we're going to take a break here, and then we're going to come back here at 5 o'clock for the generously hosted MPVA reception for you all. And so take your stuff with you. You can have a chance to run up to your room, freshen up, but be back here at 5 o'clock. There's going to be hors d'oeuvres, a cash bar, and the Marine Corps Jazz Trio will be playing. Okay? So thank you all, and see you back here at 5 o'clock.